So this is a fun day. It's a day when we actually talk about rock and roll proper. I told y'all we do that last time, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to actually talk about real, true, capital RR rock and roll and the origins of it. So let's get this party started. Pretty much everybody agrees that rock and roll starts in the 1950s. That is the decade of rock and roll music. And a lot of times the music that comes in the 60s and 70s and beyond that we tend to think of stylistically as rock music, sometimes people still call it rock and roll. But when I say rock and roll, I really do mean that music from the 1950s. So it seems like the best way to start out would be by looking at the first rock and roll song. But there's a problem, which is nobody knows for sure what the first rock and roll song is. There are a few different contenders, so let me show you all about 3 of them here, and then we'll talk about what makes them rock and roll in different people's estimations. So here's the first one. This is a song called Rocket 88, which was released by Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats. Those are the guys in the picture, and they also played under a couple other different names. They usually played under the name of Ike Turner and his Kings of Rhythm, and sometimes they were also called Ike Turner and the Rhythm Aces. But a lot of people consider Rocket 88 from 1951 to be the first rock and roll song. When you hear it, it's going to sound like a lot of the rhythm and blues songs we've listened to, like the Joe Turner Shake, Rattle, and Roll, or if you're on the Spotify playlist, some of those songs like the Louis Jordan song that's on there and things like that. It's an up-tempo song written in 12-bar blues form, but it seems like there's something about this song that might take it beyond rhythm and blues, and that's why a lot of people feel like it's sort of crossed into new territory and has become the first rock and roll song. Some things that make it more than a rhythm and blues song, perhaps, are that the beat's even harder and more edgy, and the drums are really strong. It's a very, very strong song. The other thing, too, is it's got a very distorted guitar sound. When you hear the guitar, it sounds very fuzzy and very, very crunchy sounding, supposedly because on the way to the recording session, the guys dropped the guitar amp and damaged the speaker. Then they decided they liked the sound of the damaged speaker and its buzzy, distorted sound, so they kept it for the session. But those are 2 things that make it sort of more than the rhythm and blues song. And the other thing that makes it a good candidate for a rock and roll song is that it's about cars. And cars are one of those subjects that we can't get enough of in early rock and roll. So let's give a listen to Rocket 88 by Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats.
Women have heard of jalopies, you've heard the noise they make, but let me introduce my new Rocket 88. Yes, it's straight, just one way. Everybody likes my Rocket 88. Baby, we'll ride in style, moving all along. Is smart and designed, black convertible top, and the gals don't mind. Sporting with me, riding all around town for joy. Blow your horn, Raymond, blow.
Okay, so that one rocks pretty good. Here's another song that a lot of people consider to be the first rock and roll song. It was recorded 3 years later in 1954 by Bill Haley and his Comets. It's a fairly well-known song called Rock Around the Clock. You can tell from the picture Bill Haley and his Comets are a different type of band and stuff. They have a different look to them in terms of how they dress and everything even. They were originally what was called a jump band, which was the type of bands that were prominent in the early 1950s that played a lot of rhythm and blues and stuff, and they also had a fair amount of country influence to them. In fact, some people actually consider Rock Around the Clock a rockabilly song, and we'll talk about what that is in a few minutes here. But Rock Around the Clock was a song they recorded in, I believe, 1954. It initially wasn't a big hit, but then it was featured on the soundtrack to a very popular movie about high school kids called Blackboard Jungle, and the song became a hit from that. And a lot of people consider it the first rock and roll song because it was a song that was played a lot when people first started talking about rock and roll as a musical style in 1954. So let's listen to Rock Around the Clock.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on, join me home. We'll have some fun when the clock strikes 1. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. We're gonna rock, rock, rock till broad daylight. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. When the clock strikes 2, 3, and 4, if the band slows down, we'll yell for more. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. We're gonna rock, rock, rock till broad daylight. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. When the chimes ring 5, 6, and 7, we'll be right in 7th heaven. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. We're gonna rock, rock, rock till broad daylight. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight.
And our third possibility for what is the first rock and roll song is a song by this vocal group called the Chords, a song called Shaboom. The Chords are an example of what we're going to call a doo-wop style group, and we'll be talking about that in our next video. But, you know, I don't necessarily think that any of these songs has to be certified as the first rock and roll song. This song was also recorded in 1954, and if we're just doing the chronological math, then Rocket 88 certainly is going to win because it was recorded in 1951, 3 years before the other two songs. But you know, I choose these three songs because they represent something interesting. They sort of talk about the roots of rock and roll music and stuff, which are rhythm and blues, which we see real strongly in a group like Jackie Brenston and his Delta Kings, but also the influence of country music, which shows up more strongly in a song like Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley, and then the influence of very elaborate vocal music like doo-wop music, which we see in a song like Shaboom by the Chords. So here's what Shaboom sounds like.
Life could be a dream, life could be a dream. Do, 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 shaboom. Life could be a dream. Shaboom. If I could take you up in paradise up above. Shaboom. If you would tell me I'm the only one that you love. Life could be a dream. Sweetheart, hello, hello again. Shaboom, and open we'll meet again. Boom, ding dong, ding dong, a lang, a lang, a lang. Oh, whoa, whoa, bip, a bip, a dip. Oh, life could be a dream. If only all my precious plans would come true. If you would let me spend my whole life loving you, life could be a dream, sweetheart. Every time I look at you, something is on my mind. If you do what I want you to, maybe we'd be so fine. Oh, life could be a dream. Shaboom, if I could take you up in paradise up above. Shaboom, and tell me, darling, I'm the only one that you love. Life could be a dream. Sweetheart, hello, hello again. Shaboom, and hope we'll meet again. Boom, boom.
So there you have three songs that a lot of people posit could be the first rock and roll song. And of course there are people out there who would argue that none of these songs qualify as a rock and roll song because they don't have the distinctive rock and roll beat, which we're going to see showing up when we look at the music of Chuck Berry. But at any rate, it's good to know what different historical opinions are. But let's talk about sort of what sets the stage for rock and roll to emerge. I mentioned in our last video, and I've said a couple times since then, that rhythm and blues is really a very, very strong precursor of rock and roll music, because basically when urban blues becomes more up-tempo and becomes what we think of as rhythm and blues, it almost qualifies as being rock and roll as far as a lot of people are concerned. But really, it doesn't tell the whole story of what it takes to be rock and roll. Rhythm and blues has to combine with other musical styles, one of which is country music, or as I mentioned last time, country music was often marketed as what was called hillbilly music, just like blues music was often marketed as what was called race music. But hillbilly music is going to be an element that combines with rhythm and blues to form rock and roll, which is sort of nice in a sense, because if you think about it, it defines rock and roll as a biracial musical style, right? Because rhythm and blues is predominantly practiced by black musicians, and country music is predominantly practiced by white musicians at this time. So we really have, black music and white music bringing different things to the potluck supper to form rock and roll music. But before rock and roll music, we're going to have a different style that happens with this merging of rhythm and blues and hillbilly music, a style that's referred to as rockabilly music. And the story of rockabilly music is in large part the story of a man and his record company. And that man is a fellow named Sam Phillips, who ran a record company called Sun Records in Memphis, Tennessee. Sam Phillips was a fellow who produced records and sold records and was very, very interested in urban blues music and rhythm and blues music, liked that music, and enjoyed recording that music. But he also noticed that it was a difficult type of music to sell to large audiences, in part because white audiences often had trouble listening to the music of black artists or buying the music of black artists. This is still the era of segregation and things like that. And Sam Phillips used to tell people that, he knew that the audiences, the purchasing audience, liked this black rhythm and blues style, but they would prefer it coming from a white singer. And he would joke with people that if I could find a white singer who sounded black, I could become a rich man. Well, lo and behold, guess who shows up in Sam Phillips's recording studio one day? Perhaps you've heard of him. This is Elvis Aaron Presley from Tupelo, Mississippi. And Elvis comes to Sam Phillips's recording studio to record some songs once, actually as a gift to his mother. And when Sam Phillips hears Elvis sing, he realizes, I have found that person I've been talking about. I have found that white performer who has the vocal stylings of a black rhythm and blues singer or a black gospel singer. And Elvis had grown up listening to quite a mixture of music. He'd listened to country music, he'd sung in church, so he knew all the hymns and all the gospel music, but he also would listen to black rhythm and blues music on the radio, and all those things had sort of come together to inform Elvis's vocal style, which was, very heavily influenced by the phrasing and the rhythmic nuances and the way that black rhythm and blues singers would sing, and he incorporated all those into his style. And of course, the other thing he incorporated into his style was a very dynamic stage presence. When he sang, he would gyrate his hips, which was considered rather, outre and lewd at the time and stuff. In fact, there's the famous story about when Elvis appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. They only showed him from the waist up because they thought showing a man gyrating his hips on television was too suggestive and too graphic for the 1950s television audience. I've got a little clip here of Elvis performing on the Steve Allen television show in 1956, I believe it is. and you can see for yourself Elvis's pelvic gyrations and stuff, which earned him the nickname Elvis the Pelvis. But take a look at this video clip of Elvis performing a song called Hound Dog that we'll be looking at more in depth later on the Steve Allen Show.
You waking up tomorrow.
Okay, so there's that. So Elvis has a very dynamic, very riveting stage presence. Chicks dug it. You know, the audience went crazy and screamed for him. He was a handsome man. He managed to combine different elements of looking rather clean-cut with also looking rather risky and almost juvenile delinquent-ish or something like that. So he had sort of the good boy, bad boy mystique going on that made him appealing to audiences at the time. And of course, Elvis became insanely famous in his lifetime and stuff, and especially during this period in the 1950s, which is when he does earn the name that he carries for the rest of his life of the King of Rock and Roll. Now, technically speaking, Elvis might be better thought of as the King of Rockabilly, because that's the musical style that he really pioneers and develops, working with Sam Phillips and the people at Sun Records in 1954. So let's look at these first two rockabilly recordings that Elvis did in 1954. And they're interesting songs. They're not songs Elvis wrote, they're cover songs by other artists. And the other artists he chose to cover are telling in their own sense, because he chose to cover a rhythm and blues song and he chose to cover a country song. So his influences are very, very front and center in his first recordings and stuff. So let's look at the first Elvis single that was released on Sun Records. And one song on that first single that was released by Sun Records was a song called That's All Right, Mama. It was written by a blues musician called Arthur Big Boy Crudup in 1946, and Elvis recorded it in 1954. And this rockabilly recording by Elvis, it's not going to sound like a full rock and roll band because they only have three instruments playing in it. There's Elvis playing a guitar, there's a guitar player called Scotty Moore, and there's a stand-up bass player called Bill Black. There are no drums in this song, but you'll hear sort of a percussive clicking sound in the song, and what that is that's Bill Black, the bass player, who, when he played his bass, would not just play the bass line, but would also slap the strings, and they would make this kind of clicking percussive sound. So he's sort of doing double duty in the rhythm section, doing the bass line and giving us that beat-keeping percussive sound that we expect. Other things to notice about this song, since it's a rhythm and blues song, it's written in blues form. It's a 12-bar blues form with some modifications made to it. It's a shortened 12-bar blues, but you can hear the harmony and see that it sort of follows the general trajectory of the chords in a 12-bar blues. Like I say, there are only two guitars and a bass and Elvis singing. It's a very up-tempo song. And one thing to notice also is notice the way Elvis's voice sounds. You'll hear sort of an echo or a shimmer on his voice. That's because we're moving into greater use of recording technology. And one of those recording technologies they use is an effect called reverberation, or reverb, R-E-V-E-R-B. And it was a thing that recording studios were able to do at this time, where there was a way they could electronically simulate the sound of an echo. So a singer might sound like he or she was singing in a big room, like an empty church or an empty concert hall or sound like they're singing in a cave or something, but the voice sounds very echoey and resonant. And you can tell that it's not a real true echo, that it's sort of an electronic thing. So it's an example of technology, which is going to be a big component of rock music recording, especially when we get to the 1960s and beyond. But give a listen to That's All Right Mama, and of course the thing that most people really noticed that made this song a standout in its day was Elvis's vocal stylings and the way that he had so completely sussed up the performance style of rhythm and blues artists like Big Mama Thornton and Arthur Crudup and people like that. So here's That's All Right Mama, or at least part of That's All Right Mama. You can listen to the whole thing on your Spotify list.
Well, that's all right, Mama. That's all right for you. That's all right, Mama. Just any way you do it, that's all right. That's all right. That's all right, Mama. Any way you do. Well, Mama, she done told me, Papa done told me too. Son, that gal you foolin' with, she ain't no good for you, but that's all right. That's all right. That's all right, Mama. Any way you do.
Okay, so Elvis certainly knows how to sing, and when you hear that, we're hearing something a little bit different than rhythm and blues or urban blues or country music or anything, and it's best to give it a new name, and that new name is rockabilly. Just for point of reference, here's Arthur Crudup's original version of That's All Right.
Well, now that's all right now, Mama. That's all right for you. That's all right, baby. Any way you do now, that's all right. That's all right. That's all right now, Mama. Any way you do.
Okay, interesting in its own right, but definitely Elvis found something different to do with it. And he's going to find something different to do with the other song that was on the other side of his first single, which is a song called Blue Moon of Kentucky by Bill Monroe. Perhaps you remember Bill Monroe from the country chapter we had a while back. Particularly, Bill Monroe was an example of bluegrass music. And when we hear Elvis do Blue Moon of Kentucky, we're going to notice that Elvis also doesn't really want to do this as a bluegrass song, but instead is going to find a way to put his own spin on it. Here's what the original song sounded like.
Blue moon of Kentucky, keep on shining. Shine on the one it's called and proved and true. Blue moon of Kentucky, keep on shining. Shine on the one that's gone and left me blue.
All right, so let's see how Elvis and Bill Black and Scotty Moore and Sam Phillips managed to turn that bluegrass song into a rockabilly song. Here's the Elvis version of Blue Moon of Kentucky from 1954.
Blue moon, blue moon, blue moon, keep shining bright. Blue moon, keep on shining bright. You're gonna bring me back, my baby, tonight. Blue moon, keep shining bright. I say blue moon of Kentucky, to keep on shining. Shine on the one that's gone and left me blue. I say blue moon of Kentucky, to keep on shining.
Shine on the one that's gonna let me blue. Well, the heat was on one moonlight night, stars shining bright, whisper on high, love say goodbye. Little moon of Kentucky, keep on shining. Shine on the one that's gonna let me blue. Just keep on shining. Shine on the...
Yep, that definitely was no bluegrass song, was it? But when you hear that song, you can hear how Elvis has managed to like find a way to like take his vocal style and imprint it on the song and make the song into something very, very different and something that helped to make Elvis a very, very, very famous performer. And of course, when we look at the structure of the song, it has some things in common with That's All Right, Mama. It's a fast song. It's got the same instrumentation. It's got the same use of reverberation on the voice, that same percussive bass sound going on. But they've changed a lot of stuff. They've made the song very fast and very up-tempo. They've kept the song true to its form, which interestingly is that Tin Pan Alley AABA form that we saw in all those early 20th century songs from the jazz era and stuff, and which we saw also in a song like Hank Williams' Your Cheatin' Heart. That AABA song form is very, very popular in all the musical genres. And I think it's interesting that we see that on Elvis's first record he has a 12-bar blues-based form and he has a Tin Pan Alley song form. But he was able to like take all these different musical styles he'd heard and imprint his own vocal interpretation on it. And it caught on with audiences and made him very, very famous, made him very much, a celebrity very quickly in the 1950s. And really ultimately made him too big for Sam Phillips and Sun Records to handle. Sun Records was a very small record label. It occupied one room in a storefront in downtown Memphis, I believe, and it was a small thing. It's still there today. People go visit it. It's a historical site and stuff. But Elvis became very big and needed to move on to bigger things in his career, and that's where this next gentleman enters into the picture. Colonel Tom Parker. He becomes Elvis's manager in the mid-1950s and manages Elvis throughout his career. So interesting things about Colonel Tom Parker. He wasn't actually a colonel. I don't think his name was actually Tom or Parker. I believe he was an immigrant from the Netherlands who came to America after the Second World War, seeing America as the land of opportunity where people could, become rich and famous, and he sought his richness and fame in the United States. And it was sort of a slow road there for him. In fact, at one point he actually ran a dancing chicken act in a fair. And dancing chicken acts, we're not going to see them in our day. They've been banned. What it was is people would pay like a nickel or something to see a dancing chicken act, and they would go stand, and there would be all these chickens sitting on a shiny metal stage. And then the chickens would start to get up and they'd start to jump around and they'd dance more and more furiously and stuff. And people would laugh and be like, ha ha ha, look at the dancing chickens. But what they didn't know, at least I hope they didn't know, was that the reason the chickens were dancing was because that shiny metal stage was actually a piece of cardboard wrapped in aluminum foil, and it had an electrical wire going to it that heated it up. And as it became hot and the chickens couldn't stand to be on the thing anymore, they would keep jumping up trying to keep from burning their chicken feet. So, like I say, you're not going to see that in these days of animal rights and stuff, and good riddance to that. But I've made the cynical comment sometimes that in Elvis Presley, Colonel Tom found the ultimate dancing chicken. And the reason why I say that is because through Elvis's career, sometimes Colonel Tom made decisions that, while they were very, very financially lucrative, they weren't always in Elvis's best interest. in terms of keeping Elvis at the forefront of the music world and keeping him as a strong force in the world of rock music and stuff. But Colonel Tom certainly managed to make Elvis very, very successful. In addition to getting Elvis a movie deal, and Elvis made a lot of movies through the 1950s and 60s, most of them not particularly great. They tend to show up a lot on Saturday afternoons on TV stations, I've noticed. And he also landed Elvis a recording contract with RCA Records, which was a very big record label that could certainly take Elvis and market him in a very big way. And Colonel Tom was good at getting Elvis exposure on television shows like the Steve Allen Show or the Ed Sullivan Show or things like that. I want to look at one of these RCA recordings, and it's the song we saw Elvis performing on the Steve Allen Show. It's the recorded version of Hound Dog by Big Mama Thornton. And again, she was a rhythm and blues artist, and Elvis took her song and managed to put his own imprint on it. And this is certainly one of Elvis' most famous songs and stuff. It's even in Lilo and Stitch, so y'all might know it from that if nothing else. But it's a 12-bar blues form, complete with the old-style AAB lyrics like Robert Johnson and the Delta Blues guys did in the 1930s. The instrumentation on this is closer to being a rock song than a rockabilly song, because it does have drums and electric guitars and even backup singers. It's a very fast, up-tempo song, and let's just give it a listen.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. Well, they said you was high class. Well, that was just a lie. Yeah, they said you was high class. Well, that was just a lie. Yeah, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. Well, they said you was high class. Well, that was just a lie. Yeah, they said you was high class. Well, that was just a lie. Yeah, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine.
And believe it or not, I'm going to move on from Elvis now. How can you spend so little time on the king of rock and roll? Well, because really, Elvis's greatest influence on music is in these rockabilly recordings he made in the 1950s. Elvis was always super duper famous, one of the most recognized faces on the planet to this day. But his time of being a strong influence in music was really most notable in the 1950s, particularly as the pioneering force of rockabilly music. But I want to look at another early rock and roll musician. This is a man named Jerry Lee Lewis from Louisiana, who played piano and sang, and like Elvis, became known not just for his talent as a singer and pianist, but also for his very flamboyant stage presence. Part of the rock era is that we're going to see a lot of musicians emerging who realize that you can get more attention if you have something visually striking about yourself. For Elvis, it's the hip gyrations and things like that. For Jerry Lee Lewis, it was a very, very wild stage presence where he'd stand up while he played piano. Sometimes he'd play it with his foot. When you hear the song Great Balls of Fire that I'm going to play for you, and you hear his piano solo, you'll notice when he plays the piano that a lot of times, instead of playing just a note at a time with a finger or something, he's got his whole hand or his arm and he's just running it up and down the piano, and it makes a lot of noise, and it's really kind of an exciting sound. But here's Jerry Lee Lewis doing Great Balls of Fire.
You shake my nerves and you rattle my brain. Too much love drives a man insane. You broke my will, but what a thrill. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire. I let you love what I thought it was funny. You came along and woo, now honey, I've changed my mind. This love is fine. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire. Kisses, baby. Feels good. Hold me, baby. Well, I want to love you like I love a should. You're fine, so kind. Got to tell this world that you're mine, 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 mine. I chew my nails and then I twiddle my thumb. I'm real nervous, but it sure is fun. Come on, baby. It drives me crazy. It's just great balls of fire.
So there you go. Now, like Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis initially started recording on Sam Phillips' Sun Records label. Sam Phillips did pretty well at finding talent in the 1950s. In fact, this picture here is what was called the Sun Records $1 Million Quartet, because 4 people who Sam Phillips had on his label at one point in the 1950s were Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, that's the fellow in the green shirt over there, and the man with the guitar and the blue shirt was a guy named Carl Perkins, who maybe didn't become as famous as the other 3, but was still quite famous. Had a lot of rockabilly hits, the most famous one being a song called Blue Suede Shoes that Elvis actually used to feature in his performances. So don't feel bad for Sam Phillips losing Elvis to RCA Records. He did pretty well for himself, and certainly, did the music world quite a service in being able to find the talent he found and encourage these guys to explore different ways to combine elements of different music to create this new musical style of rockabilly and other things. But ultimately, some of these guys go different ways. Elvis goes to RCA Records. Johnny Cash becomes a country artist. But these are 4 early important figures of rock and roll. This next guy I'm going to show you is maybe the most important figure of rock and roll. This is Chuck Berry from St. Louis, Missouri. Chuck Berry, I don't necessarily think anybody invented rock and roll single-handedly, but if I had to say who comes closest to it, this is the guy. Chuck Berry is the guy who becomes closest to really putting in place all the elements that make rock and roll rock and roll. In fact, we've got that little quote from John Lennon right there. If you tried to give rock and roll another name, you might call it Chuck Berry. That's not too much of an overstatement. Chuck Berry grew up listening to, like Elvis, he grew up listening to a lot of different styles of music, and 2 that were particularly strong for him were country music and rhythm and blues music. And Chuck Berry actually goes to Chicago and records for the Chess Records label, which is where Muddy Waters and musicians like that recorded. And in recording the songs he does, they manage to combine rhythm and blues and country in such a way that they become a new style that's not rockabilly even, but that is rock and roll. And we'll talk about what makes rock and roll as we go on here. The other things Chuck Berry does that are important is, in addition to giving rock and roll its identity, and that identity is basically what we would call the rock and roll beat. All the songs we've been listening to through the jazz era and things like that, like the Glenn Miller songs, even songs like Shake, Rattle, and Roll, and a lot of rhythm and blues songs, they're all songs that use what we call a shuffle beat. And that shuffle beat is basically a sped up version of what we hear in the Robert Johnson blues songs. Robert Johnson has that dump, bump, 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 long, short rhythm that goes in a lot of his songs. Well, a lot of the rhythm and blues songs take that shuffle beat and just speed it up. By the way, I have a drum set, so I thought I'd use it. What Chuck Berry does is he takes that shuffle rhythm, that long, short rhythm, and he makes all the notes equal. 2 even notes on a beat. And that straightening out of the beat becomes the beat that is associated with rock and roll. You know, if you look at the jazz songs and the rhythm and blues songs, all of them, even when they're fast, they go da 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 da. But Chuck Berry's the guy who thinks about making the beat even out and going da da ba da 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 ba da 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 ba da da. And that is the rock and roll beat. And Chuck Berry got there first. So that's why I say he's the guy who invented rock and roll. Another thing that makes him really important is he sort of invents the rock and roll guitar style. A lot of the things that guitarists think of as what are essential ingredients of rock and roll guitar playing, a lot of the things that every guitar player learns how to do are techniques that Chuck Berry puts in place first, and he pioneers those. So, you know, that two big things to think about Chuck Berry as being an important architect of rock and roll. And just like Elvis, just like Jerry Lee Lewis, he also is one of those people who realizes that showmanship should not be neglected at this time. So in addition to inventing the rock guitar style to a great extent, and in addition to straightening out the beat, he also has these little cliches that he learns to do when he performs that are things that are visually exciting for audiences when they watch him. Probably his most famous maneuver was a thing called the duck walk, where he'd crouch down and walk back and forth while he was playing his guitar, and his head would bob back and forth. But if you see videos of Chuck Berry, you'll notice that a lot of times when he performs, he'll tend to prance around and do these things like the duck walk and stuff, and things that would get the audiences excited when they heard him. And that was something the audience liked. And something Chuck Berry was good at was figuring out what the audience liked. In fact, one reason that he was so successful is because he wrote his own songs, and his songs really talked to things that would be of interest to his audience of teenagers in the 1950s. His songs are about things like cars or American pop culture and things like that. And of course, there are boy-girl songs and things like that. They all tend to be very, very up-tempo and very, very happy, excited songs. But he was really good at figuring out what would connect with his audiences. Vocally, his singing style is interesting because even though he was very influenced by rhythm and blues artists and urban blues artists like Muddy Waters, his vocal style isn't especially bluesy or anything. The voice he sings in is actually a very clear, easy to understand voice. It's sort of weird, It's almost like if you think about Elvis as being a white man who sings like a black man, then people might also think sort of differently about Chuck Berry as being a black man who sings like a white man, because his voice, his delivery is very clear and you can understand what he's saying and stuff like that. But Chuck Berry's songs, in addition to being lyrically things that people could relate to, there was also something nice and familiar about them. It's like going into McDonald's. When you go to McDonald's, you know what's on the menu. You know what you're going to get. Same thing with a Chuck Berry song. Chuck Berry songs tend to follow a formula. They tend to often be based on the 12-bar blues. A lot of them are just straight-up 12-bar blues progressions. The instrumentation tends to be what becomes the standard instrumentation for rock bands. Guitars, bass, drums, piano, and singer. Chuck Berry is one of the people who really helped solidify the instrumentation of a rock band. And most of his songs tend to start out with a very distinctive little guitar intro. In fact, you can tell a Chuck Berry song from the first 2 seconds off. And here's an example just randomly off of my phone of 3 Chuck Berry songs. Here's the beginning of Roll Over Beethoven. Here's the beginning of Carol. And here's the beginning of Back in the USA. So you can see the man's got a formula that works for him, and he uses it in a lot of these songs that make him famous and become sort of classics of the rock and roll repertoire. And the one I want us to listen to in its, well, not in its entirety, you can listen to it in its entirety on Spotify, but the one I want us to listen to a lot of is Roll Over Beethoven, which is an interesting song because it features all those things that make Chuck Berry Chuck Berry. The trademark guitar solo that opens it, it's based on the 12-bar blues, it's got the instrumentation we expect, and the lyrics are about things that would be of interest to his audience. And one thing that was of interest to his audience was how cool rock and roll music sounds. So this is a song about how cool rock and roll music sounds, and it actually is making the case that rock and roll music is not just as cool as, but cooler than classical music. So, you know, and he is basically saying, roll over Beethoven, tell Tchaikovsky the news. And the news is that there's a new sheriff in town, and that sheriff is rock and roll music, which has supplanted classical music as the great music of the age. So here's Roll Over Beethoven by Chuck Berry. By the way, I still like Beethoven and Tchaikovsky just fine.
My local DJ. Yeah, this is a jumping little record I want my jockey to play. Roll over Beethoven, I gotta hear it again today. You know my temperature rising, the jukebox blowing a fuse. My heart beating rhythm and my soul keep a singing the blues. Roll over Beethoven, tell Tchaikovsky the news. I got the rockin' pneumonia, I need a shot of rhythm and blues. I caught the rolling arthritis sitting down at a rhythm review. I roll over Beethoven, they're rockin' in 2 by 2. Well, if you feel it and like it, go get your lover, then reel and rock it. Roll it over, then move on up, just a try for further, then reel and rock with. Run another roll over Beethoven, dig these rhythm and blues.
And yet another one of the great founding fathers of rock and roll is this fellow, Richard Penniman, better known as Little Richard from Macon, Georgia. Little Richard who, like Jerry Lee Lewis, played the piano, and Little Richard who, like Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis and Chuck Berry, made for himself a very striking stage persona that really drew attention to him. If you look at these pictures of him, he has a definite look that he likes. He's got that pompadour hairstyle and a little pencil thin mustache, and he often wore makeup like lipstick or eyeliner when he performed or something like that. He was a very outlandish looking character in the 1950s when most of the men were walking around in business suits with buzz cuts, and everybody looked very straight-laced and normal. And here comes Little Richard looking like Little Richard. And his style of singing was also very over the top. He has a lot of screaming and shouting in his songs that make his songs very, very exciting and stuff. And his stage presence was very dynamic. You can tell from that picture down in the lower part of the page there that, just like Jerry Lee Lewis, a lot of times playing the piano for him would be an athletic endeavor where he would actually put his foot on the piano and jump around and shout and stuff. And you can hear all those things really clearly in this 1955 song by Little Richard, probably his most famous song, a song called Tutti Frutti. I'll tell you all a little bit about Tutti Frutti here, I suppose. So Tutti Frutti is a song that Little Richard knew from hearing it performed in gay clubs in Louisiana and stuff. Little Richard was not an openly gay character per se in the 1950s. You know, certainly his look would have made a lot of people at the time suspect him of being gay or something like that, but he certainly wasn't out the way we think of people being out in our day and time. That would be something that wouldn't get you very far with audiences in the 1950s. But Tutti Frutti was a song that was performed in gay clubs in Louisiana and places like that. It was originally a dirty song. The lyrics were Tutti Frutti, good booty, and then it got worse from there. Little Richard basically took those lyrics, cleaned them up a little bit, and made it into the song that we all know today as Tutti Frutti. And probably the most famous aspect of the song is the way the song begins, which is just with Little Richard, coming right in and screaming a wop bop a loo bop, a wop bop bop. And then the song launches, and just like we would expect with a lot of rock and roll songs, it's based very strongly on the 12-bar blues. It's an AAB arrangement. It's got the band that we would expect to have: guitars, bass, drums, piano, also saxophones. It's an up-tempo song, and it's a really good showcase for Little Richard's very, very vibrant vocal style. So here's Tutti Frutti.
Wop bop loo mop lop bop bop tutti frutti, oh rude, tutti frutti, woo, tutti frutti, oh rude, tutti frutti, oh rude, tutti frutti, oh rude. Wop bop loo mop lop bop bop. Got a gal named Sue, she knows just what to do. I got a gal named Sue, she knows just what to do. She brought me to the east, she brought me to the west, but she's the gal that I love best. Tutti frutti, oh rude, tutti frutti, woo, tutti frutti, oh rude, tutti frutti, oh rude, tutti frutti, oh rude. A womp bum loo mop a lump bum bum. Got a gal named Daisy, she almost drives me crazy. I got a gal named Daisy, she almost drives me crazy. She knows how to love me, yes indeed. Boy, you don't know what you're doing to me. Tutti frutti, oh rude, tutti frutti, woo, tutti frutti, oh rude, tutti frutti, oh rude, tutti frutti, oh rude. Oh, womp bum loo mop.
And I've got one more founder of rock and roll I want us to look at today, and that's Buddy Holly. And if you look at the pictures of him here, he doesn't necessarily look like he's going to be able to hold his own visually with Elvis and Little Richard and Chuck Berry and people like that, but let's not sell this guy short, because he actually does a lot of things that if he didn't do them, I'm not sure when they would have gotten done. But Buddy Holly actually brings a lot of the spirit of innovation to rock and roll that comes to characterize the music in the 1960s. Buddy Holly was from Lubbock, Texas, which is like way out in the middle of nowhere. And like a lot of these guys, like Elvis and Chuck Berry and stuff, grew up listening to country music and rhythm and blues music on the radio, and starts performing it himself and forms a little group called the Crickets. And it's with the Crickets that he records a lot of his music. Some of it he records as a solo artist, but a lot of his early success is done with his band, the Crickets. And Buddy Holly is, like I say, a very important force in rock music. One evidence is this. A lot of times naming things is important. It's sort of a form of tribute. When people have children, they name them, like they name sons after their fathers, or perhaps you're named after a family member like a beloved aunt or great aunt or something like that. When I was talking about the Rolling Stones, I mentioned they were very influenced by rhythm and blues music and urban blues, and they named themselves from that line in the Muddy Waters song about he's going to be a Rolling Stone. Buddy Holly and the Crickets also exert this type of influence because about 10 years, well, about 5 years down the road from when Buddy Holly and the Crickets are big. You know, Buddy Holly and the Crickets are big in 1956 and 57. A few years later in England, when John Lennon and Paul McCartney are trying to think of a name for their band, they realize that, you know, one of the people who really influences us and who we really like is Buddy Holly and the Crickets. So maybe we should name our band after insects too. And that's how they become the Beatles. So let's just listen to some of this Buddy Holly music and see what all the fuss is about. And here's the first Buddy Holly song I want us to look at. We're going to look at a few of his songs, but the first one I want us to look at is a song from 1957 called Oh Boy. So check out this excerpt of that song.
All of my love, all of my kissing, you don't know what you've been missing, oh boy. Oh boy, when you're with me, oh boy. Oh boy, the whole world can see that you were meant for me. All of my life I've been waiting, tonight there'll be no hesitating, oh boy. Oh boy, when you're with me, oh boy. Oh boy, the whole world can see that you were meant for me. Stars appear and the shadows are falling, and you can hear my heart calling. A little bit of loving makes everything right. I'm gonna see my baby tonight. All of my love, all of my kissing, you don't know what you've been missing, oh boy. Oh boy, when you're with me, oh boy. Oh boy, the world can see that you were meant for me. Dum dum dum, oh boy, dum dum dum, oh boy. My love, all of my kissing, you don't know what you've been missing.
Okay, and it sounds like an early rock and roll song, right? It's got the right instrumentation, you know, guitars, bass, drums. Form-wise, it's an AABA form. I'm telling you, you know, people can't get enough of these and stuff. And we call the A's the verses and we call the B the bridge for a song like this. You know, one thing that people notice in Buddy Holly's songs is the way Buddy Holly sings. It's not a very rhythm and blues style of singing at all. It's not, nobody's going to think they're hearing Elvis. You know, he's closer to Chuck Berry in terms of having a very clearly articulated vocal style, but he makes that sound, that almost hiccupy sound when he sings sometimes, which is sort of his little vocal mannerism that distinguishes his singing sometimes. And when we hear Buddy Holly's songs, what we notice is that one thing that Buddy Holly seems to do that separates him from the pack, especially from somebody like Chuck Berry, is Buddy Holly seems to be always trying to like push the envelope and sort of figure out what else can you do with a rock song? What else can happen? You know, Chuck Berry certainly doesn't do that. You know, as I said, Chuck Berry has kind of a formula for writing a song, and it's a very successful formula and it works, you know. Guitar intro, 12-bar blues, song about cars and teenage stuff, boom, away we go. Buddy Holly, though, tends to play with the ingredients more and experiment with rock songs. A song like Oh Boy, that's very straightforward. That's like a lot of rock songs go. But this next song I'm going to show y'all is a little bit different. It's a song called Not Fade Away. Now, just reading the page here, it doesn't really sound like it's going to, or look like it's going to be that different. You know, it's an AABA form, sort of. It's the same instruments. But one thing that's really different about this is the way they treat the beat. You know, I mean, Chuck Berry treated the beat differently. He turned it into a rock and roll beat, and it was there, da-da-ba-da-da-da-ba-da. But it was all the way through the song. It never stopped. And all those songs before Chuck Berry, like the shuffle songs and stuff, the beat also never stops. The beat keeps going on and on. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. This song, though, has a very syncopated beat, and there's a lot of space between the notes in this song, and it's almost kind of confusing to people. The song isn't, the beat is rather complicated sounding, and all the syncopation makes it difficult to hear exactly where the beats are, which means this song isn't really a very good song for dancing. It's almost like this song is meant to be listened to. Oh my gosh, just like real music. But listen to Not Fade Away, and especially notice that sort of disorient effect they create with the beat. It's an interesting thing.
I'm gonna tell you how it's gonna be. Are you gonna give your love to me? I wanna love you night and day. You know my love will not fade away. Oh, well, you know my love will not fade away. My love is bigger than a Cadillac. I try to show it when you're driving me back. Your love for me got to be real, for you to know just how I feel. A love for real, not fade away.
Told you it was interesting. This other song is also interesting. It's one of Buddy Holly's most famous songs. It's called Peggy Sue. In terms of how it's put together, it's not any great shakes. It's got a lot of 12-bar blues for the verses, and then it's got a little bridge. So what happens is he actually manages to take these 12-bar blues and create an AABA form out of it. So he's sort of using the two big songwriting styles to do this. But one thing that's interesting about it is, just like Not Fade Away, it doesn't have a really strong dance style beat at all. Instead, it's got a lot of drums in it. The drums are playing all the way through, playing a lot of notes like that. But it's a definite different way of approaching the beat. And you'll also notice that there's a lot of reverberation on his voice. It's very echoey sounding. And the other thing that this song has, and I'm not sure if any of the other songs have featured before, is a thing called overdubbing. And that's another one of those recording studio tricks that becomes available in the 1950s and stuff. What overdubbing is this? Overdubbing is where when people go to record something, in the old days when they went to record something, it was like if you record something on your phone. You just pressed record and you caught whatever happened, and boom, you had a recording of it, and that was it. With overdubbing, what happened is people could record something and then they could wind it back and they could record again, and what they just recorded would be there, and they could record new stuff on top of it. So in this song we have Buddy Holly actually using this overdubbing technique, where I guess the first thing they did was record the drums and the guitar we hear at the beginning and the voice, but then there's a guitar solo later on, and what they did was they just played the recording, and while that was playing, Buddy Holly went back and played the guitar solo on top of it. So it's a way to layer instruments, put more things here, make the music more complex and more multi-layered. And Buddy Holly is one of the people who really sort of delves into that and starts experimenting with it in the 1950s. And boy, oh boy, are people like those Beatles going to experiment with it in the 1960s. So here's Peggy Sue.
If you knew Peggy Sue, then you know why I feel blue without Peggy, my Peggy Sue. Oh, well, I love you, galleys, I love you, Peggy Sue. Peggy Sue, Peggy Sue, oh, how my heart yearns for you, oh, Peggy, my Peggy Sue. Oh, well, I love you, galleys, I love you, Peggy Sue. Peggy Sue, Peggy Sue, pretty, 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 pretty Peggy Sue. Oh, Peggy, my Peggy Sue. Oh, well, I love you, gal, and I need you, Peggy Sue.
I love you.
and one final Buddy Holly song. I think he's that important. So, pretty little song, soft song called Every Day. Not a rock song at all. It's written as an AABA style song. And the instrumentation isn't what we'd expect for a rock song at all. It's an acoustic guitar, no electric guitars in sight, and it doesn't even have drums. Instead of drums, what happens is the guy who played the drums just sat there and slapped his knee the whole time. And I think he may have actually played on a typewriter too and used the clicky sound of that. So we don't have electric guitars, we don't have drum set, and we have this weird little instrument called a celesta in it. It's a keyboard instrument from the 1800s. It sounds a little bit like a bell-like instrument, like a glockenspiel. If you've ever seen the Nutcracker at Christmas, the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, it has a little keyboard solo in it. Ya da dum dum bum bum ba da 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 ya dee da dee da. That's a celesta solo. Or if you've ever watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on TV, whenever the trolley comes in from the land of make-believe, there's this keyboard music that accompanies it. That's played on a celesta. It's sort of a little magical sounding instrument, and you'll hear it in this song. So here's Every Day by Buddy Holly.
Every day it's a getting closer, going faster than a roller coaster. Love like yours will surely come my way. Hey, hey, hey. Every day it's a getting faster. Everyone said go ahead and ask her. Love like yours will surely come my way. Hey, hey, hey. Every day seems a little longer, every way love's a little stronger. Come what may, do you ever long for true love from me? Every day it's a getting closer, going faster than a roller coaster. Love like yours will surely come my way. Hey, hey, hey.
Okay, and on that note, I am done talking about rock and roll, at least capital RR rock and roll and stuff. Because, you know, rock and roll, while it's such an important thing and it's such a force in music, the actual true proper rock and roll has a very, very limited lifespan. You know, it only lasts from about 1954 until, you know, the end of the 1950s. And after that, we sort of move into different things. But, you know, certainly these five guys we've talked about today, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, and Elvis Presley, are all the founding figures of rock and roll music. And they're all very, very important. And by the end of the 1950s, they're all going to be out of the picture in some way for some reason, a different reason in each case. Let's talk first about the guy who came closest to inventing rock and roll. Let's talk about Chuck Berry. By the end of the 1950s, Chuck Berry's career is going to be put on hold because Chuck Berry is going to wind up doing a little bit of prison time. Prison time for having violated a thing called the Mann Act. That's M-A-N-N Act. It was a law in the 1950s, and it was a law about sexual conduct and stuff. And Chuck Berry was found guilty of violating the Mann Act for transporting an underage girl across state lines for immoral purposes. So he does a little bit of prison time for that, which takes him out of the forefront of the music world. He comes out of prison in the early 1960s and resumes his career, but by that time things have sort of moved on and there's not as much interest in Chuck Berry style rock and roll. People are into different types of music, the types of music we'll be talking about in our next video. So Chuck Berry goes on hold because of this prison sentence he serves at the end of the 1950s. Little Richard also leaves the rock and roll scene at the end of the 1950s. Little Richard is a rather conflicted type of person and stuff. Because in addition to being a rock artist and in addition to being gay, he's also somebody who comes from a very strong Pentecostal holiness background. A lot of these musicians actually grew up in the Pentecostal church. Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Little Richard, all three were part of the Pentecostal church, which really is the gospel style that informs rock and roll a lot. In fact, if you look at videos of Pentecostal church services in the 1950s, it looks a lot like what rock and roll is going to look like. You know, in terms of the way people react during the music, in terms of the way people perform. A lot of Pentecostal churches didn't like rock and roll music when it came out, and it wasn't because they felt like it was evil per se, it's because they felt like these guys were stealing their worship style and trivializing it to turn it into rock songs rather than making it a worship style of music. But Little Richard goes back and forth on things, and at the end of the 1950s decides that rock and roll is not a moral lifestyle and goes instead to seminary to become a minister. Now, he's going to flip-flop a few different times during his life and going to come back out as a performer and then go back in as a minister. And ultimately, you know, he lived his life as a celebrity. He just recently died and, you know, did things, among other things he's done. One of the last things he did that you may have seen is he did a Geico commercial a couple years ago. But Little Richard leaves the rock scene to go to the seminary. So he's out of the picture. So let's talk next about Jerry Lee Lewis. Oh boy, Jerry Lee. What did Jerry Lee do to take himself out of public favor at the end of the 1950s? He got married. Seems like a wholesome enough activity, right? Yeah, well, it gets a little bit worse. Jerry Lee Lewis got married to his first cousin, who was 13 at the time. And remember, the 1950s is a very, very conservative time in American history, and there's only so much people can take. And apparently one thing people can't take is guys marrying their 13-year-old cousins. So there's a lot of public backlash of that, and Jerry Lee Lewis sort of loses his prominence. Now he's still out there to this day going around and performing and stuff, but that's the thing that takes Jerry Lee out of the picture. And Elvis, the king of rock and roll, well, the thing that happened to Elvis is, you know, while he grew up between he was famous between the Second World War and the Vietnam War, so there was no actual war going on except the Cold War. And there was a peacetime draft going on, and Elvis got drafted. In fact, here's this great letter that some girls wrote to President Eisenhower when they found out Elvis had been drafted. They basically wrote and said, you know, we don't want Elvis to go to the Army. We think that would be horrible if he went to the Army, but even if he goes to the Army, please don't cut his sideburns off. We'd just die. And of course, to let the president know they were really, really serious, they drew a little heart down at the bottom there. So, you know, they wrote this letter to the president asking, please don't draft Elvis. Did it work? Not a bit. There's G.I. Elvis Aaron Presley in the Army with his sideburns gone and everything. Now, in all fairness, Elvis probably could have found a way to get out of the draft. But, you know, to his credit, he stepped up when he was called and decided to go serve his country and spent a couple years stationed in Germany as an Army private. And when he came back, he resumed his career mostly in movies and stuff like that, but he did continue recording music. But by that time, his presence as an influencer was over. He was never as powerful of an influence on music, even though everybody always called him the king of rock and roll. He wasn't really as strong of a force when he came back. And that brings us finally to our fifth guy, Buddy Holly. And this is the actual really sad one because Buddy Holly dies. In 1959, after a concert in, I believe it was Clear Lake, Iowa, it was a snowy night, and they were getting ready to go to the next place where they were going to perform the next day. And a lot of concerts at that time were different. It wasn't just one act, but a lot of different acts would perform, and they would just do like 3 or 4 songs. So Buddy Holly gets in a plane with Ritchie Valens and a guy called J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson. And then the plane takes off, but the plane crashes, and all three of them die in that plane crash. So that'll certainly take you out of the music scene. And the death of Buddy Holly is actually something that we'll come back and visit again when we talk about singer-songwriters in the 1970s, because one song we'll look at is a song called American Pie by this guy named Don McLean, who keeps coming back to the refrain in the song of "The Day the Music Died." And it's a song about how strongly he was impacted by Buddy Holly's death in 1959, where he felt like that was the day when the music died. So, 5 great architects of rock and roll in the 1950s: Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Buddy Holly. All of them with these very, very short periods of power and influence in music, and all of them out of the picture by 1960. But of course, music doesn't stop. So what we got to talk about next time is what happens. And what we'll talk about next is sort of what takes rock and roll's place when all these founding fathers of rock and roll are gone. For want of a better term, it's what a lot of people call pop music. And we'll be looking at some pop music from the 1950s and 60s. Now, it's good music, but it's a different type of music. In fact, I've got my Bono quote down there. I've spared y'all any Bono quotes this far, but one thing Bono from U2 said once that struck with me is, pop says everything's okay. Rock says, no, it isn't. So we'll talk a little bit about what this music that says everything's okay is like. And we'll talk about how the music business starts to change in the rock and roll era and beyond. So I will see y'all then. Enjoy. Keep rocking.